Hey guys, and welcome back to Monka, where stupid shit ensues, but today I beat a video game, so I kind of wanted to talk about it, because, I have a lot of opinions about it, but the game that I beat more recently, about 5 days ago I'd say, was Valkyria Chronicles 4, specifically the version on the Nintendo Switch, but it was also released on PS4 and PC, I believe. I do not know if the Xbox One got released. I don't believe it did. Valkyria Chronicles 4, kind of an interesting story, because I beat it, but I had previously played it when it came out around fall of 2018. I just never beat it. I got about 4 chapters in, and for whatever reason, I don't know why back then, but I dropped it for whatever reason. I really enjoyed it, so there really was no reason to why I dropped it at the time. But more recently, I decided, well, I might as well come back to it and play it because I enjoyed it back then. So I don't know why I ever dropped it, so I had the urge to beat it. So I did. It took me around 47 hours. The long and the short of my opinion on Valkyria Chronicles 4 is, honestly, this is a great game. Like, it's a really good game with really unique concepts that is unfortunately pretty flawed in some aspects, which really holds it back from being like an amazing game. Still though, it's a great game despite its flaws. It's just kind of unfortunate that it has those flaws. But Valkyria Chronicles 4 is Sega developed and published, was released around fall of 2018. Like I said before, it took me about 47 hours to beat it, but without further ado, let's get into some of the more finer details. So in terms of the graphics, I always like to start off talking about the graphics. And in terms of the graphics, this is actually something where I'll actually kind of delve into the graphics, because usually I'm kind of like, I don't give a shit about the graphics. But the graphics of Valkyria Chronicles 4 is actually pretty cool, and it's worth talking about since it has more of a cel-shaded type of graphical style that looks really nice in the game. And also it kind of gives me 13 vibes with the way it's kind of set up, due to the fact that gunfire will have like a rat-a-da-da-da, kind of like the comic book style. It kind of has that, what 13 has, if you remember that game. When people move around, it kind of goes shuffle, shuffle, shuffle. When cars or gunfire, it goes or like it has like the visual, like the lettering on the screen. If you ever played 13, you kind of know what I mean, but it has that kind of style to it, which is really unique and neat because you really don't see that in games that often. So to see that graphical style in the game and to see like that type of like visuals, I guess, as kind of like 13 was really cool. So in terms of the graphics, it's actually pretty neat. My only complaint is that it kind of goes heavy on the comic book thing. It has this weird like white outline around the game window, and I don't know why it does that, but it does. I think it's just for graphical stylization, but I personally didn't like it that much. It doesn't really detract from the game. I just wish there was an option to disable it, but overall the graphics are actually pretty neat. They may be kind of timeless because it's just like there's nothing really to date them, to be honest. In terms of sound design, in terms of the music in particular, the music isn't anything amazing really. Like, it's okay, it's a good musical, it's very passable, it fits its setting very well, but there aren't really any standout tracks in this composition, to be honest. It's cool that it's pretty orchestral heavy with pretty much no synthesis to it. It's pretty brass heavy as well, I'd say. Kind of like what you'd expect from like kind of like a war movie or something like that. But really the soundtrack does what it needs to do, but it's nothing really like outstanding, to be honest. Like, there's not really any songs on the soundtrack that I'm going to be coming back to in the future. Now in terms of the voice acting, you get 2 options per the usual of JRPGs. You can either play it with English voice acting or Japanese voice acting. Since English was the default, I just went with English, and to be honest, it's fine voice acting. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this voice acting at all. I would say, pushing the point that it's actually pretty good voice acting for the most part. Really, there's nothing offensive about the voice acting. The worst voice acting in here is probably for like really minor characters, but the main characters are all voice acted pretty well, so it really isn't that big of an issue. But in terms of the sound design, it all pretty much does its job. There's no complaints here about that. Now in terms of the story and characters, the story of Valkyria Chronicles 4 is actually pretty unique, like I've said, for a JRPG, since it's actually based during something called the Second European War, which is kind of like an alternative universe version of the Second World War. And it's actually pretty cool to see a setting like this in a JRPG, because this is not a very common JRPG setting. Like, usually when it's a war, it's like medieval times or like fantasy wars. This is like an actual war with like tanks and firearms, to something like almost like a real war in like modern times. So that setting in a JRPG is actually really cool, and as well the lore they build around the story of this kind of like Second European War, with actually some like deep lore and actual connections to like Second and First World War is actually really cool. It's just like an alternative take, like I said, on like the Second World War, and even it references to like a First European War that has like ties to World War I. So it's actually like the story and lore of Valkyria Chronicles 4 is actually really cool. Now when you actually get down to brass tacks, the story focuses on the Second European War, but more specifically focuses on a specific squad, which is called Squad E, and their leader, Claude Wallace, and it pretty much follows their story through the Second European War. And to be honest, it's a pretty good story. I enjoyed it enough, you know, it's a war story, so it's kind of simple. Now, near halfway through the story, they attempt to kind of introduce some fantasy settings into it, so it's not like a pure war. It's kind of like there is some fantasy mixed in with this. It kind of makes the story kind of weird, but it's fine. The fantasy settings near the end of the story make it end off kind of weird, but otherwise, it's a fine story, and I enjoyed it enough. But more or less, what makes you really enjoy the story are actually the characters, because the characters are the ones that really carry the story. Kind of like, I've said this like at least a million times with JRPGs, but this is kind of another game where the characters carry the story. There are a handful of main characters, and there's a lot of side characters in this game. The main characters are all actually really well done and built up really well, and they're really given personalities, and you really watch them evolve throughout the course of the story. So the characters are actually done pretty well. The voice actors do their part to carry these main characters really well. And in terms of the side characters, unfortunately most of the side characters are kind of put to the side. You get a lot of side characters, to be honest, because you'll unlock a lot of them and have a lot of them join your squad throughout the story. They do actually get their characters built up through something called squad stories, which is pretty much when you play with them enough, you actually unlock side stories that you can play through that build up their characters, which is really cool. But if you don't play those, they really don't get their characters built up that much. With that being said though, you can witness their characters through battling and through picking them and putting them in battle. And they all have really unique and funny personalities, so it makes the game pretty enjoyable. But in terms of story and characters, the story is really good. I really enjoyed this like deep lore alternative take on the Second World War. They do muddy the waters by introducing fantasy settings though, which is kind of like, I don't mind it, to be honest. I get it, it's a JRPG, they like to, you know, do weird shit like that. It just makes it kind of weird, and near the end it kind of muddies the story to where it's not like a pure world war, it's kind of like a fantasy world war, but it's fine. It just makes the story kind of weird near the end. In terms of the characters, the main characters do their part, and you enjoy watching them develop into better characters and like progress in their personalities. In terms of side characters, unless you play the squad stories, they really don't get their characters built up. I would recommend playing at least some of the side stories. But in terms of the gameplay is pretty much split into two parts. You have the kind of visual novel side of it that tells the story, which is good because it's just, you know, it's a visual novel and it tells a good story, so it's enjoyable. And then you have the missions in the game, and the missions are going to be where the actual gameplay happens. And the gameplay for Valkyria Chronicles 4, a lot like the story, is super unique. Like, a JRPG has never done this before, but it's pretty much a third-person shooter that is a turn-based third-person shooter. It is like nothing I've ever played before, and it is super unique and super cool. Like, this is a concept that is like, I don't even know how to explain it, because it's like, it is so unique to play like a turn-based third-person shooter that it is awesome. You have pretty much units to pick from, you deploy them, you move around the battlefield with like a AP system that runs out eventually, so you can't infinitely move, but then you aim and shoot, or you take whatever actions you want on the field, kind of like a third-person shooter, just you take turns doing it. I mean, the closest thing I can compare it to is Worms 3D. Even that's not like even close to Valkyria Chronicles 4, because they're two separate games entirely, but that system is really, really cool. Unfortunately, where the game gets kind of marred is by their choices on how they set up missions. Now, when you're playing through just objective-based missions with this turn-based third-person shooter, it is really unique and cool, and it's just really a lot of fun just to play through it, like simple objectives, like take this objective or destroy these enemies enemies or hold this area. Like, that's fine, honestly. It's only becomes a problem when they start introducing boss battles and like second phases to battles, and also like adding a timed aspect to it, which this game does a decent amount of, and that is where this gameplay really gets marred, unfortunately. In terms of like second phases, if they tell you that there's going to be a second phase, it's fine. But if they don't, and that second phase comes out of nowhere and your squad just kind of gets wiped out due to the fact that you didn't know that you were going to have another battle, it really just feels cheap, to be honest. When you have to replay the mission, it doesn't feel like you're replaying it because you fucked up, because you can fuck up. Like, this game is pretty brutal to the point where if you make a wrong move, it will like mess you up and like you'll be punished. So that's fine for like a lose scenario, is like getting punished for making bad decisions. But when you're getting punished because the game decides to throw a second phase at you that you had no idea about, and so your characters are all scattered because you planned on winning the battle and they throw you into an ambush or whatever, it just feels really cheap. And honestly, I wish the game didn't do that because it just feels really cheap. Now as well, when you have objective based battles going on and they throw in boss battles, it feels really cheap as well because you feel like you have to focus on either the objective or the boss, and the bosses are just really strong, so when they're introduced onto the field, they can just wipe you out really quick. And it really leads to you learning the cheese tactics and just like cheesing missions later in the game, and it just doesn't feel good, to be honest. Like, that just becomes kind of the meta of just like, you know, cheese tactics. Like, you can equip like certain abilities or buff certain units a certain way to the point where they can be heavy hitters, and literally a machine gunner can just mow down a tank, and like, that's cheesing, but it also feels like the game cheats you sometimes in those missions. So when you're on a time limit and the game throws a boss at you and you have to move on to an objective in a certain amount of turns while trying to fight off a boss, it just feels really cheap, and I wish they didn't do that. And as much as I hate the boss battles, honestly, I just wish they would have kept the boss battles to the boss battles and not introduced like bosses into main missions, because it just really makes them unfun to play. Now, the time limit missions aren't really all that bad, to be honest, unless they introduce a boss. It kind of feels cheap at points because it makes you feel like instead of taking a strategic approach to a mission, you're just rushing through to attempt to beat the timer. And I don't really enjoy that, because the aspects of Valkyria Chronicles 4 that I really enjoyed was taking my time and planning out my attack and slowly but methodically moving through a level and taking out enemies to pretty much take it a decisive victory that, yeah, maybe it's taken slow, but it's also decisively taken because I'm making very specific moves to make sure that I don't mess up. When you're put on a time limit, it feels like you're trying to rush through those missions, and like you can fuck up more quickly, and you feels like you're messing up more often because you're being forced to move faster. Even though I got bad ranks on a lot of early missions just because I was taking my time, it felt a lot more satisfying because I planned out the missions and took my time. So in terms of time limit missions, I didn't really enjoy them, and my final complaint really is about boss battles. Now, boss battles are just kind of funny because I don't know, really, I can't blame the developer for putting them in, because when you have to take characters out of the story, you have to do it somehow. So they have to do boss battles to take the characters out of the story, but they're just really poorly done, and honestly, I just cheesed most of them because it just kind of felt like I didn't enjoy the boss battles at all. I didn't want to play them legitimately. They're just not fun, to be honest. Like, I didn't enjoy the bosses when they're introduced into main missions because they just felt like cheap, and they just felt like obstruction of trying to actually achieve my objectives and just felt unfun, really. And doing boss battles was just no better, really, which is unfortunate because it really just mars the fun part of this game, which is just playing through objectives slowly, methodically, and just winning objectives through decisive decisions instead of being rushed to make decisions like boss battles do, or like bosses introduced into main missions do. But other than that, you have ways of building up your units. You mainly have, I think, around 7 main units. You have your vehicles, then you have your riflemen, then your assault class, which is, I believe they call them shock troopers, which is pretty much like your rush machine gunner class. You have lancers, which is like your anti-vehicle units. You also have your engineers, which repair vehicles and also have improved healing capabilities. And then you also have snipers, which are just your long-range snipers, and grenadiers, which are pretty much your mortars on the team. The strongest units by far in this game, excluding the vehicles, are snipers and grenadiers, because snipers have the range to take out enemies in one hit, and then grenadiers can also grenade enemies in places at a decent distance, and also, but they can get them where most of your normal units won't be able to hit them. My squad build would usually go with like 2 tanks, 2 engineers, 2 grenadiers, 2 snipers, and then usually my other ones were like a rifleman and a shock trooper, because mainly your engineers, until until your riflemen hit elite riflemen at level 10 are just objectively better than your riflemen due to the fact that they have the same rifles, they just have improved capabilities for healing, so you mainly just want them, especially since they can replenish teammates' ammo. They're just better than riflemen pretty much in every way until riflemen get rifle grenades, which makes them a bit better, but it's kind of unfortunate because team composition makes sense to kind of lead only in one direction. Like, you really want snipers and grenadiers and tanks because that just works out the best for you. And other than that, other units you can have, they're just usually just best to have just because, just in case enemies rush you. But it kind of sucks that the team composition really is limited to what is the best team composition. I hope if they ever do Valkyria Chronicles 5, they introduce more units. I hope they take away power from some units so you have to vary your builds, to be honest, because I feel like engineers hold a lot of power, and as well grenadiers do, and so I hope they do more units in Valkyria Chronicles 5 just to make it so your team composition has to be more unique. But in terms of the gameplay, I enjoyed the visual novel aspects. I enjoyed team building and like trying to come up with strategies for teams. I really just did not enjoy the cheap elements introduced into the game, because I feel like when you're playing just straight through simple objectives like take this point or take out these things and hold this or whatever, it's really fun because you can really just take a strategic approach to it. When they introduce time limits, when they introduce boss battles, or when they introduce boss battles into those type of just objective based missions, it just really makes it unfun just because it feels like you can't really take a strategic approach and you just have to either cheese it or just lose the battle if it's during a second phase or whatever, and you just have to retry and just plan on what you know is going to happen instead of, you know, slowly but strategically taking one try at it. Honestly, I just hope they take some of those elements out of the future sequel, especially second phases that they don't tell you about, because those just felt cheap. There was one in particular that I remembered that was a second phase that introduced a boss in the second phase, and it just wiped out my squad and I lost that mission. It just felt really cheap. But the core game here is really awesome and unique, especially in the gameplay. I just hope some of those cheese elements are just taken out of the sequel. But overall, my opinions on Valkyria Chronicles 4 is that this is a really good game. I would say a really great game. Unfortunately, its aspects of what I've discussed in the gameplay make it flawed and hold it back really from being an amazing game. Like boss battles, second phases, shit like that just really hold it back from being an amazing game. I think this future sequel could really benefit from introducing more units to it, because honestly, some units hold a lot of power, and so I hope if they introduce more units, I think they'd be able to vary up your party builds. But I really enjoyed Valkyria Chronicles 4 despite its flaws. When I slowly but just strategically beat those simple objective-based missions, it felt really satisfying. Unfortunately, near the end, I just started to burn out of this game, but it was mainly due to the boss battles and second phases that really started to burn me out of this game. So unfortunately, near the end, I just stopped enjoying it as much as I was. The core game here is really great, and I highly recommend playing it. If you just want something unique in the JRPG genre, this works. It is super unique. Like, there is nothing like it, to be honest, but I would recommend it probably getting it on Steam, because this is just the vanilla version with no extras added to it. You can get the complete edition on Steam on a sale for $25, which not only has the base game, but has all the extra content that they ever introduced into the game, which is absolutely worth it for a $20, $5 price tag, considering you're getting like 45 hours of gameplay in the base game. That just adds like even more. Honestly, in conclusion, Valkyria Chronicles 4, if you're interested, I highly recommend trying it. It just realize that there's going to be flaws going into it, but if you can like get over the flaws, it is a really great game. And honestly, I hope they make Valkyria Chronicles 5 and they just make it a hit out of the park. Honestly, I hope I love it when I play it. But thank you very much for watching. Until next time, I'll see you. Stay chill.